During a transatlantic flight to London, both pilots collapse from a mysterious illness. The only hope for the 300 passengers lies with a former Air Force pilot who hasn't flown in 5 years. What she does next stuns everyone on board. Emily. Chen sat in her modest apartment, staring at the wall of medals that seemed to mock her these days. The Distinguished Flying Cross, Combat Action Medal, and various other commendations hung lifeless, gathering dust, just like her dreams of flying. Again, the rhythmic tapping of rain against her window matched the perpetual throbbing in her right leg, a constant reminder of the crash that had ended her Air Force career. At 32, Emily had already lived several lifetimes' worth of experiences. She'd flown combat missions over hostile territory, saved countless lives with emergency medical evacuations, and earned the respect of everyone in her squadron. But that was before the accident, before the shrapnel tore through her aircraft and her life, leaving her with a damaged leg and wounds that went far deeper than any physical injury. The flight simulators in her living room, professional grade, equipment that had cost her most of her savings, were her only connection to the sky now. Every night, after finishing her shift as a technical writer, she'd spend hours in front of these screens, running through scenarios, practicing emergency procedures, and trying to keep her skills sharp. Her therapist called it an unhealthy obsession. Her family worried it was preventing her from moving on. But to Emily, it was oxygen, the only thing keeping her alive in a world where she could no longer soar. "You need to let it go, Em," her sister Jennifer had said during their weekly video call. "It's been 5 years. You have a good job now, a stable life. Why keep torturing yourself with what you can't have?" The concern in Jennifer's voice only made Emily feel more isolated, more misunderstood. Emily's response was always the same: a tight smile and a quick change of subject. How could she explain that flying wasn't just something she did? It was who she was, the steady hands that had guided aircraft through sandstorms, the quick thinking that had saved her crew more times than she could count, the absolute certainty she felt in the cockpit. These weren't just skills, they were integral parts of her soul. That morning, as Emily packed her carry-on for a business trip to London, her leg was particularly bothersome. The weather forecast predicted storms across the Atlantic, and her old injury always acted up when pressure systems changed. She popped 2 ibuprofen and checked her flight details one more time. United Airlines 847, departing JFK at 9:45 p.m. The irony wasn't lost on her. A former pilot reduced to being a passenger, strapped in with the rest of the civilians, trying not to flinch every time the plane hit turbulence, but she had no choice. The conference in London was mandatory, and her job at the technical writing firm was the only thing keeping her afloat financially. Her disability pension from the Air Force barely covered her basic expenses, let alone the maintenance costs. For her simulator equipment, as Emily locked her apartment door, she cast one last glance at her wall of medals. In the dim morning light, they seemed to gleam with an intensity that made her chest tighten. For a moment, she could almost smell the jet fuel, feel the vibration of the engines, hear the steady chatter of radio communications. Then she blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the hollow echo of her cane against the hallway floor as she made her way to the waiting taxi. What Emily didn't know, couldn't know, was that this routine business trip would soon become anything but routine. In less than 24 hours, she would find herself facing a situation that would test everything she'd learned in her years of military service and countless hours in the simulator. A situation that would force her to confront not just her physical limitations, but the fear and doubt that had grounded her more effectively than any injury ever could. The sky was waiting for her, as it always had been, and this time, when it called, she would have to answer, whether she was ready or not. The lives of everyone on board would depend on it. The bustling atmosphere of JFK International Airport felt suffocating to Emily. every announcement over. The PA system, every glimpse of uniformed pilots striding purposefully through the terminal, sent a jolt of painful nostalgia through her chest. She clutched her cane tighter, forcing herself to maintain a steady pace as she made her way to the security checkpoint. "Ma'am, you'll need to remove your shoes and any metal items," the TSA agent said, eyeing her cane. Emily bit back a bitter laugh. 5 years ago, she would have been walking through the crew entrance, proudly wearing her Air Force uniform. Now, she was just another passenger, struggling to maintain her dignity as she awkwardly maneuvered through security. Her phone buzzed, another message from Jennifer. "Called Mom. She's worried about you flying alone. Maybe you should have taken the video conference option instead." Emily deleted the message without responding. Her family's overprotectiveness, though well-intentioned, had become increasingly stifling over the years. As she waited at her gate, Emily found herself unconsciously analyzing everything around her. The wind patterns visible through the massive terminal windows, the subtle changes in the sound of arriving aircraft, the way the gate agents coordinated their movements. It was all stored and processed with the precision that had once made her one of the Air Force's top pilots. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8, stopped in front of Emily's seat, staring at her cane with unabashed curiosity. "Did you hurt your leg?" she asked, earning an embarrassed reprimand from her mother. Emily managed a small smile. "Something like that," she replied, remembering a time when she would have been happy to share her stories of flying with an interested child. Now those stories felt like wounds that had never quite healed. The boarding process began, and Emily waited until her group was called. As she made her way down the jet bridge, she couldn't help but glance into the cockpit. The captain, a middle-aged man with graying temples, was going through his pre-flight checklist. For a moment, their eyes met, and Emily quickly looked away, fighting the surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "Need any help with your bag?" a flight attendant asked, as Emily struggled to lift her carry-on into the overhead compartment. The question was innocent enough, but it stung. Emily shook her head, gritting her teeth as she forced her trembling arms to complete the task. She refused to be helped, refused to be seen as weak or incapable. Settling into her seat, Emily pulled out her tablet, opening the flight simulator program she'd modified for commercial aircraft. Her therapist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, had repeatedly suggested she delete these apps, arguing that they were preventing her from accepting her new reality. "You're holding on to a past that's causing you pain," she'd said during their last session. "Sometimes moving forward means letting go," but Emily couldn't let go. Instead, she'd thrown herself deeper into the virtual world of aviation. She'd spent countless hours studying commercial flight procedures, memorizing emergency protocols, and running scenarios that most passenger pilots would never encounter. It was her way of staying connected to the sky, even if she could never physically return to it. The cabin crew began their safety demonstration, and Emily found herself mouthing the words along with them. She knew every procedure, every protocol, every possible emergency response by heart. It was both a comfort and a torment, like knowing all the words to a song you could never sing again. As the plane taxied to the runway, Emily closed her eyes, feeling the familiar vibrations through the floor. Her right leg throbbed, phantom, pains mixing with real ones as her mind wandered back to that last flight. The warning lights, the explosion, the desperate struggle to keep the aircraft stable as they lost altitude. She'd managed to save her entire crew that day, but the cost had been her career, her identity, her purpose. The massive engines roared to life, and the aircraft began its takeoff roll. Emily's hands instinctively twitched, muscle memory trying to perform actions she'd done thousands of times before. She forced them still, gripping the armrests instead. Next to her, a businessman in an expensive suit glanced at her white knuckles and offered a sympathetic smile. "Nervous flyer?" he asked. Emily almost laughed at the irony. "Something like that," she replied, using the same evasive answer she'd given the little girl earlier. How could she explain that her anxiety came not from a fear of flying, but from the agony of being a passenger in a world where she once commanded the skies? As the plane climbed through the clouds, Emily pulled out her phone one last time before it had to be switched to airplane mode. There was another message from Jennifer. "Just want you to be safe, Em. Call me when you land." Below it was an older message from her mother. "Honey, please consider a different job, one that doesn't require so much travel. We worry about you." Emily turned off her phone, leaning back in her seat as the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude. They didn't understand. None of them did. This wasn't about being safe or avoiding travel. It was about finding a way to exist in a world where your deepest passion, your very identity, had been torn away. The simulators, the studying, the technical writing job that kept her close to aviation, these weren't symptoms of an inability to move on. They were survival strategies, ways of keeping her soul alive in a grounded body. The plane continued its climb into the darkening sky, carrying Emily toward an encounter that would force everyone, her family, her doctors, and most importantly, herself, to re-evaluate everything they thought they knew about healing, purpose, and the true meaning of being a pilot. 3 hours into the flight, the first signs of trouble appeared. The smooth cruise had given way to occasional bumps, and Emily noticed the subtle changes in engine pitch that indicated the pilots were requesting altitude changes to avoid weather systems. Her years of experience told her they were flying into increasingly challenging conditions. Emily pulled up the flight tracking app on her tablet, studying the weather patterns ahead. A massive system was developing over the Atlantic, much more severe than the initial forecasts had predicted. She could feel it in her leg too. The dull ache had intensified into a sharp, persistent pain that seemed to predict the approaching storm better than any meteorological equipment. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a soft ding, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened." His voice was calm and professional, but Emily detected the subtle tension that only another pilot would recognize. Young flight attendant passed by, checking seatbelts. Emily caught her eye and asked quietly, "How's the weather system looking up ahead?" The flight attendant paused, surprised by the technical nature of the question. "It's manageable," she replied carefully, but Emily noticed how she gripped the seats a little tighter as she moved down the aisle. The businessman next to Emily had fallen asleep, his laptop still open to a spreadsheet full of numbers. Across the aisle, a mother was trying to calm her frightened child as the turbulence increased. Emily found herself instinctively analyzing every shake and shudder of the aircraft, her mind automatically running through the procedures she would be implementing if she were in the cockpit. Her tablet flashed with a new weather update, and Emily frowned at the radar image. The storm system had intensified dramatically, forming a wall of severe weather that stretched for hundreds of miles. They'd need to deviate significantly from their planned route to avoid the worst of it. As if confirming her thoughts, she felt the aircraft begin a gradual turn to the north. The cabin lights flickered briefly as the plane encountered stronger turbulence. Emily's hands moved unconsciously, muscle memory from thousands of hours of flight time attempting to correct for movements that she had no control over. She forced them still, but her mind continued to race through emergency procedures and backup systems. A flash of lightning illuminated the cabin through the windows, followed by a rumble that vibrated through the entire aircraft. The sleeping businessman jerked awake, looking around in confusion. More passengers were beginning to show signs of anxiety. Nervous whispers, white-knuckled grips on armrests, worried glances out the windows into the darkness. Emily pulled out. Her logbook, not her old Air Force One, but a personal journal she'd kept since the accident. In it, she documented every flight she took as a passenger, noting weather conditions, aircraft responses, and crew procedures. Her therapist had suggested the practice as a way to process her transition from pilot to passenger, but it had become something more, a way to stay connected to the technical aspects of flight that she missed so desperately. As she wrote, her mind wandered back to her last therapy session before this trip. Dr. Martinez had been particularly persistent about Emily's unhealthy attachment to aviation. "You're using these technical details as a shield," she'd said, "a way to avoid dealing with the emotional impact of your trauma. At some point, you need to accept that you're no longer a pilot." The words had hurt more than Emily had let on. She'd smiled politely, nodded in the right places, but inside she'd felt a deep sense of rebellion. How could she explain that being? A pilot wasn't just what she did, it was the lens through which she saw the world. Every weather pattern, every mechanical sound, every subtle shift in air pressure was part of a language she'd spent her life learning to read. Another bout of turbulence, stronger this time, sent a drink cart rattling in the galley. Emily noticed the flight attendants exchanging concerned glances as they secured loose items. The plane made another turn, more pronounced than the last, and Emily could tell they were trying to find a smoother route through the strengthening storm. She checked. Her watch, still over 3 hours to London. The storm system ahead showed no signs of weakening, and they had limited options for deviation, given the fuel requirements for a transatlantic crossing. Emily found herself running fuel calculations in her head, old habits refusing to die despite years of being grounded. Through the window, she could see the strobing lights on the aircraft's wing, illuminating clouds that were growing increasingly turbulent. The smooth, stratified layers of cruising altitude had given way to towering cumulus formations that spoke of severe instability in the atmosphere. Each flash of lightning revealed the massive scale of the storm system they were attempting to navigate. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time with a more urgent tone. "Flight attendants, please suspend service and secure all equipment." Emily sat up straighter, recognizing the subtle shift in protocol that indicated escalating concern in the cockpit. She could feel it in her bones. Something wasn't right. The combination of weather patterns, aircraft behavior, and crew response was setting off warning bells honed by years of military flight experience. As she stared out into the storm-ravaged night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that all her years of simulation practice, all the hours spent studying commercial aviation procedures, were about to become more than just a way to stay connected to her past. The sky, it seemed, wasn't finished with her yet. The next hour brought deteriorating conditions that made Emily increasingly uneasy. The turbulence had evolved from occasional bumps to sustained periods of violent shaking that tested the aircraft's structural limits. What bothered her most wasn't the turbulence itself, but subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior that her experienced senses couldn't ignore. Through the cacophony of rattling overhead bins and nervous passenger chatter, Emily detected a slight irregularity in the engine sound, barely noticeable but present. Her military training had taught her to trust these instincts, to recognize that sometimes the smallest anomalies could be harbingers of larger problems. A flight attendant stumbled past, grabbing seatbacks for support. Emily caught her arm gently. "Is everything all right in the flight deck?" she asked, keeping her voice low to avoid alarming nearby passengers. The flight attendant hesitated, her professional smile slipping for just a moment. "The pilots are handling the situation," she responded mechanically, but Emily saw the worry in her eyes. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, illuminating the cabin in stark bursts of white light. In those brief moments of illumination, Emily studied the faces of her fellow passengers. The businessman had abandoned any pretense of work, his laptop stowed and his hands gripping the armrests. The mother across the aisle was singing softly to her child, trying to mask her own fear with forced cheerfulness. Emily pulled out her tablet again, but this time, instead of checking weather radar, she opened a different program. One she'd developed herself by combining commercial flight systems with military emergency protocols. She began running scenarios, calculating possible routes through the storm system, analyzing fuel reserves and alternate landing sites. Suddenly, the aircraft dropped sharply, causing several passengers to scream. Oxygen masks deployed in several rows, a malfunction triggered by the violent movement. The cabin crew rushed to restore order, but Emily's attention was fixed on something else. The distinct change in the engine's pitch she'd noticed earlier had become more pronounced. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, but instead of the usual reassuring tones, there was an edge of strain that sent chills down Emily's spine. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some technical difficulties along with the weather. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Our crew is working to resolve the situation." Emily's military training kicked in, her mind automatically cataloguing every detail. The irregular engine sound, the subtle changes in cabin, the pressure, the slight list to starboard that most passengers wouldn't notice, all pieces of a puzzle that was becoming increasingly concerning. She reached for her cane, tucked securely under the seat in front of her, gripping it not for support, but for reassurance. A flight attendant hurried past again, this time moving with purpose toward the cockpit. Emily caught fragments of rushed conversation through the galley curtain. Medical emergency. Both of them. Need to land. The pieces started falling into place, and Emily felt her heart rate accelerate. She thought about her sister Jennifer's last message, about her mother's constant worry, about Dr. Martinez's insistence that she move on from her pilot identity. What would they think if they knew she was sitting here, analyzing an emergency situation as if she were still in the cockpit? Would they see it as more evidence of her inability to adapt, or would they finally understand that being a pilot wasn't just a job she'd lost, but a fundamental part of who she was? The aircraft banked sharply to the right, and through her window, Emily caught a glimpse of St. John's, Newfoundland, the nearest diversion airport capable of handling a wide-body aircraft. But something about the angle of the turn, the sluggish response of the controls, told her they weren't going to make it that far. The cabin pressure suddenly dropped, causing ears to pop and anxiety to spike among the passengers. Emily's trained eye caught the flight attendants' barely concealed panic as they hurried through their emergency procedures. The irregular engine sound had become a distinct whine, and the aircraft's list to starboard was now noticeable enough. The drinks on tray tables were sliding. In that moment, Emily felt a strange calm settle over her. The pain in her leg, the years of doubt and frustration, the well-meaning but suffocating concern of her family, all of it faded into the background. What remained was the core of who she was. A pilot, trained to handle exactly this type of situation. She unzipped her carry-on bag, pulling out a small notebook where she kept detailed notes on commercial aircraft systems, part of her unhealthy obsession with staying connected to aviation. As she flipped through the pages, she could almost hear Dr. Martinez's voice. "You need to accept your new reality." But what if this was her reality? What if all those hours in the simulator, all that studying of commercial aviation procedures, had been preparation for this moment? The intercom crackled again, but this time it was a flight attendant's voice, tight with barely controlled fear. "If there is any medical doctor on board, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately." Emily knew what that meant. Something was very wrong in the cockpit. Her hands steady, her mind clear, she began to unfasten her seatbelt. Whatever was coming, she was ready to face it, leg injury and all. The sky had given her another chance, and this time she wouldn't let her limitations ground her. The cabin erupted into chaos as two flight attendants rushed past with the aircraft's medical kit. Emily stood up, steadying herself against the seat as the plane shuddered through another bout of turbulence. Her cane clattered to the floor, but she barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the cockpit door, visible through the gap in the first-class curtain. "Ma'am, you need to stay seated," a young flight attendant called out, trying to maintain order in the increasingly panicked cabin. Emily turned to her, speaking with the quiet authority that had once commanded military crews through combat zones. I'm a former Air Force pilot," she said, her voice steady and clear. 5 years combat experience, specialized in emergency operations. Whatever's happening up there, I can help." The flight attendant hesitated, conflict visible on her face as she weighed protocol against necessity. Another violent shake rocked the aircraft. Through the windows, lightning illuminated the massive storm cell they were trapped in. The engine sound had deteriorated further, and Emily could feel the aircraft struggling to maintain level flight. They were running out of time. "Allow me to help," Emily said, this time louder, her voice carrying over the growing panic in the cabin. "I can fly this plane." The declaration silenced the nearby passengers, their faces turning toward her with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The businessman who had been sitting next to her stared, recognition dawning, as he remembered her white-knuckled grip during takeoff, not from fear, but from restraining herself from reaching for controls that weren't there. The lead flight attendant emerged from the cockpit, her face pale. She locked eyes with Emily, who was now standing firmly despite the turbulence, her military bearing evident even without a uniform. "Both pilots are sick," she announced, her professional composure cracking. "Food poisoning, we think. They're not responding well to treatment." Emily was already moving forward, her right leg protesting, but her stride purposeful. "I need to see them, now." The authority in her voice brooked no argument. As she reached the cockpit door, she turned to the lead attendant. "Contact air traffic control. Tell them you have a qualified pilot on board with military experience. They'll need to know." The cockpit was a scene of controlled chaos. Both pilots were slumped in their seats, conscious but clearly incapacitated. The acrid smell of vomit permeated the small space. The aircraft's warnings were a symphony of urgent chimes and alerts, each one speaking to Emily in a language she had never forgotten. "Get them out of here," Emily ordered, her tactical training taking over. "They need medical attention, and I need space to work." As the crew helped the sick pilots out, Emily slid into the captain's seat, her hands automatically finding their positions on the controls. 5 years melted away in an instant. The instrument panel swam into focus, airspeed indicator showing their struggle against the wind, altitude fluctuating more than it should, engine readings confirming her earlier suspicions of trouble. Through the windscreen, sheets of rain and bursts of lightning created an apocalyptic tableau. Emily keyed the radio. "London Control, United 847 Heavy. Be advised, original flight crew is incapacitated. You are now speaking with Emily Chen, former Air Force pilot, assuming emergency command of this aircraft." Her voice was clear and professional, betraying none of the emotions surging through her. The response was immediate, though tinged with surprise. "United 847, London Control. Please confirm your credentials and current situation." As Emily rattled off her military service number and a quick situation report, her free hand was already making adjustments, fighting to stabilize the aircraft's erratic movement through the storm. A particularly violent gust caught the aircraft's wing, causing a sharp roll to the right. Emily's muscles remembered instantly, countering the movement with practiced precision. Her injured leg screamed in protest as she worked the rudder pedals, but she pushed the pain aside, focusing entirely on the task at hand. "United 847, we are declaring an emergency. Emily announced, her voice steady. "Request immediate vectors for nearest suitable diversion airport. Be advised we are dealing with severe weather, possible engine issues, and—" She glanced at the fuel gauges. Marginal fuel state due to weather holds. As she waited for a response, Emily's mind was already running through scenarios, calculating fuel reserves, analyzing weather patterns. The simulation program she'd spent countless hours with had kept her skills sharp. But now she was facing the real thing, hundreds of lives depending on her ability to remember, to perform, to overcome. Through the cockpit door, she could hear the flight attendants trying to calm the passengers. Someone was crying, someone else was praying. Emily blocked it all out, focusing only on the instruments in front of her and the stubborn determination that had gotten her through countless missions before. A memory flashed through her mind, her therapist's voice, "You need to let go of who you were." Emily's lips curved in a grim smile as her hands moved confidently across the controls. She wasn't letting go of anything. She was exactly who she had always been, a pilot facing impossible odds, ready to fight for every soul on board. The radio crackled with new coordinates, and Emily began the challenging task of navigating through the storm system toward safety. Her right leg throbbed with each adjustment of the rudder pedals, but the pain was almost welcome now, a reminder that she was alive, that she was flying, that she was exactly where she needed to be. United 847, we are reviewing your situation. The controller's voice came through, professional but concerned. Please stand by for emergency procedures. Emily acknowledged the transmission, her eyes never leaving the instruments. The storm raged outside, but in the cockpit a different kind of storm was breaking. The years of doubt, of restraint, of being grounded, all giving way to the pure, focused clarity of a pilot doing what she was born to do. The next 30 minutes were a brutal test of Emily's skills and endurance. The storm intensified, turning the sky into a battlefield of wind and lightning. The starboard engine's irregular sound had developed into a concerning whine, and fuel reserves were dropping faster than she'd like due to their extended battle against the headwinds. United 847, London Control. Shannon Airport reports severe. Crosswinds exceeding aircraft limits. Suggest divert to Manchester. New heading 085, descend and maintain flight level 280. The controller's voice was steady, but Emily could detect the underlying tension. Emily's legs seized with pain as she adjusted the rudder pedals, fighting to keep the aircraft stable in the violent turbulence. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her hands remained steady on the controls. The years of simulator practice had kept her muscle memory intact, but the physical demands of actually flying the aircraft were testing the limits of her injured body. The lead flight attendant, Sarah, had remained in the cockpit, serving as an impromptu co-pilot. "How can I help?" she asked, watching Emily wrestle with the controls. Emily's military experience kicked in. She had worked with untrained crew members before in emergency situations. "Monitor the engine gauges," Emily instructed, pointing to the relevant displays. "Call out any changes in the readings, especially on the starboard side." She quickly taught Sarah the basic parameters to watch for, her voice remaining calm despite the chaos around them. A violent gust caught the aircraft, causing a sharp drop in altitude. Several screams echoed from the cabin. Emily's injured leg protested as she fought to stabilize the plane, each movement sending shots of pain through her body. But she couldn't let go. Wouldn't let go. Not now. Not with so many lives depending on her. "Engine 2 temperature rising," Sarah reported, her voice tense but controlled. Emily glanced at the gauges, her mind racing through emergency procedures. The engine was struggling, possibly damaged by the severe weather. They needed to reduce power before it failed completely. United 847, declaring priority fuel situation, Emily transmitted, her voice remaining professional despite the growing crisis. Request direct routing to Manchester and priority handling. She knew they were burning through their reserves faster than planned, leaving them with precious little margin for error. Lightning flashed blindingly close, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The aircraft shuddered violently, and warning lights bloomed across the instrument panel. The autopilot disengaged with a sharp warning tone, forcing Emily to take full manual control. "Circuit breakers!" Emily called out to Sarah. "Check for any that have popped." As Sarah began her inspection, Emily fought to maintain control, her injured legs screaming in protest as she worked the rudder pedals. The simulator hadn't prepared her for the physical toll of hand-flying a large aircraft through severe turbulence. Memories of her last flight in the Air Force flashed through her mind. The warnings, the struggle for control, the impact. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't going down. The passengers in the cabin, the crew depending on her, even her own demons, she would not let any of them fall. United 847, weather radar shows gap in storm system at your 2 o'clock 15 miles, the controller advised. Suggest immediate right turn to heading 120 to avoid worst of weather. Emily studied the radar. Seeing the narrow corridor of relatively calm air, it would mean flying through more turbulence to reach it, but it was their best chance. "Sarah, make an announcement," Emily ordered, preparing for the maneuver. "Tell everyone to remain in their seats and stay calm. We're going to experience some strong turbulence, but we're going to get through this." Her voice carried the quiet confidence that had once led military crews through combat zones. As Sarah made the announcement, Emily began the challenging turn. The aircraft bucked and shuddered, fighting her every move. Her leg felt like it was on fire, but she forced herself to focus only on the instruments, on the next adjustment, on keeping them alive. "Engine 2 temperature critical," Sarah called out. Emily could hear the fear in her voice. The warning lights confirmed what Emily had dreaded. The engine was failing. They would have to shut it down to prevent catastrophic failure. United 847, declaring emergency, Emily transmitted. "Engine 2 failing, shutting down. Request immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport." Her hands moved through the engine shutdown procedure with practiced precision, even as her mind raced through single-engine landing calculations. The aircraft rolled slightly as the engine spooled down, but Emily was ready for it, compensating. With the remaining engine and adjustments to the control surfaces, they were committed now, no turning back, no second chances. Everything would depend on her ability to nurse the crippled aircraft to safety. Through the storm-lashed windscreen, Emily caught glimpses of the dark Atlantic below. Somewhere ahead lay Manchester, their best hope for survival. Her leg throbbed, mercilessly, but she welcomed the pain now. It kept her focused, kept her fighting. She thought of all the times people had told her to let go of her pilot identity, to accept her limitations, to ground herself in a normal life. But there was nothing normal about this moment, about the hundreds of lives depending on her ability, to remember, to perform, to overcome. This was who she was, not just a pilot, but a warrior. And warriors didn't give up, no matter how fierce the battle. The English coast appeared through breaks in the storm clouds, a dark line against the angry sea. Emily's world had narrowed to the cockpit instruments and the constant battle to keep the aircraft stable. With one engine down and fuel reserves critically low, every decision could mean the difference between survival and disaster. United 847, Manchester approach. Weather deteriorating rapidly, ceiling now 400 feet, visibility less than a mile, wind 290 at 35 knots, gusting to 50. The controller's voice carried the gravity of their situation. These were barely acceptable. Conditions for a fully functional aircraft, let alone one operating on a single engine. Emily's leg had gone from burning pain to an almost numbing agony, but she forced herself to focus. The years of simulation practice had prepared her mind for this, even if her body was struggling. She began the approach briefing, her voice steady despite the strain. "Sarah, I need you to be my co-pilot now," Emily said, looking at the flight attendant who had stayed by her side through the crisis. "I'll talk you through everything. We're going to do this together." She quickly explained the critical instruments Sarah needed to monitor, teaching her the basics of approach procedures in minutes. The aircraft shuddered as they descended through layers of turbulent air. Every movement of the controls required more strength now, as if the storm itself was fighting their survival. Emily could feel the strain in her arms, her injured leg trembling as she worked the rudder pedals. 10,000 feet! Sarah called out, her voice tense but controlled. They were committed to the approach now, their fuel situation leaving no margin for a go-around. Emily thought of her sister Jennifer, of her mother's constant worry, of Dr. Martinez's insistence that she move on from flying. What would they think if they could see her now? Through the rain-streaked windscreen, brief glimpses of Manchester's lights appeared and disappeared in the storm. Emily's military training kicked in, her mind automatically calculating descent rates, wind corrections, and single-engine performance. Limitations. The simulator sessions that everyone had criticized as obsessive were paying off. Every procedure, every emergency protocol was fresh in her mind. United 847, be advised, emergency vehicles in position, the controller reported. Runway 23R cleared for landing. Wind now 340 knots, gusting 55. The crosswind was beyond the aircraft's normal limits, but they had no choice. Emily began configuring the aircraft for landing, her movements precise despite her exhaustion. The landing gear extended with a reassuring thud, but the additional drag made the aircraft harder to control. Emily's injured leg screamed in protest as she fought to maintain directional control. Sweat ran down her face, but her hands remained steady on the controls. 5,000 feet, Sarah announced. Rate of descent 1,000 feet per minute. Emily nodded, her focus absolute. The years of feeling grounded, of being told to accept her limitations, seemed to fade away. In this moment, she was exactly who she had always been. A pilot, facing impossible odds with skill and determination. The aircraft broke through a layer of clouds and suddenly the ground was visible, a blur of lights through the driving rain. Warning alarms competed for attention as they descended through 3,000 feet, the single operating engine straining to maintain their flight path. United 847, wind shear alert in your area. Multiple aircraft reporting severe turbulence on final approach. The controller's warning was barely necessary. Emily could feel the aircraft bucking and rolling as powerful gusts battered them from all directions, 2,000 feet. The runway lights appeared briefly through the rain before disappearing again. Emily's leg felt like it was being stabbed with every rudder input, but she forced herself to ignore the pain. The lives of everyone aboard depended on her ability to push through her physical limitations. 1,000 feet, Sarah called out, her voice tight with tension. Sink rate high, Emily corrected instantly, fighting the aircraft back onto the proper glide path. The storm seemed determined to deny them safe haven, throwing everything it had at the crippled aircraft. Through the rain and darkness, the runway threshold lights beckoned. Emily could feel the aircraft wanting to roll, the single engine and strong crosswind creating forces that threatened to overwhelm their desperate landing attempt. Her injured leg trembled with fatigue, but she refused to yield. 500 feet, Sarah announced, runway in sight. The aircraft shuddered violently as a gust caught them, forcing Emily to use every bit of her strength and skill to maintain control. The years of being told she couldn't fly anymore, that she needed to accept her new reality, fueled her determination. Emily began their final descent, her voice calm as she talked Sarah through each step. The runway grew larger in the windscreen, a strip of salvation in the storm-torn night. 200 feet. The aircraft rolled suddenly as a massive gust hit them from the side. Emily's leg exploded in pain as she stamped on the rudder pedal, fighting to keep them aligned with the runway. 100 feet. The threshold lights flashed beneath them. Emily's world narrowed to a laser focus. Airspeed, descent rate, runway, alignment. Everything she had ever learned, every hour in the simulator, every combat mission she'd flown, had prepared her for this moment. 50 feet. Sarah's voice seemed distant now. The ground rushed up to meet them, the storm's fury making these last seconds an epic battle between pilot and nature. Emily's leg felt like it was being torn apart, but her hands remained steady on the controls. She was a pilot. She would always be a pilot, and she was going to prove it to everyone, including herself. The wheels touched down with a screech of rubber against wet runway, but Emily knew the hardest part wasn't over. Fighting against the gusting crosswind with only one engine, she kept the aircraft centered as they hurtled down the runway at over 150 miles per hour. Her injured leg burned as she worked the rudder pedals, fighting to maintain directional control. "Reverse thrust," Emily commanded, her voice steady despite the strain. Sarah, who had proven herself an invaluable impromptu co-pilot, helped monitor their speed as Emily focused on keeping the massive aircraft on the runway. The rain hammered against the windscreen, the wipers barely able to maintain visibility. Emergency vehicles raced alongside them, their lights painting the rain-soaked runway in alternating patterns of red and blue. The aircraft shuddered as another gust hit them broadside, trying to push them off the runway. Emily's arms trembled with exhaustion as she fought the controls, but her determination never wavered. As their speed dropped below 100 knots, Emily felt the aircraft becoming more manageable. The years of simulator practice, the countless hours studying commercial aircraft systems, all culminated in these crucial moments. Her leg might be screaming in protest, but her mind was clear, focused, processing every input and making split-second adjustments. Finally, at 60 knots, Emily began to ease off the brakes, carefully managing their deceleration on the wet runway. The storm continued to rage around them, but they were down, they were safe, they had made it. As the aircraft slowed to taxi speed, the cabin erupted in applause and cheers of relief. "United 847, welcome to Manchester." The controller's voice carried a note of admiration. "Emergency services will escort you to the gate. Outstanding job, Captain." The word "captain" sent a surge of emotion through Emily that she quickly suppressed. There would be time for feelings later. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she helped coordinate with ground control. "I can't believe we did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Emily managed a small smile, her focus still on the task of taxiing the damaged aircraft to the gate with one engine. As they approached the terminal, Emily could see the crowd that had gathered. Airport personnel, emergency responders, and news crews were already positioning themselves, alerted to the drama that had unfolded in the storm-dark skies above Manchester. The final taxi to the gate seemed to take an eternity. Emily's leg had begun to shake uncontrollably, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the crisis starting to ebb. But she maintained her composure, guiding the aircraft with the same precision she had displayed throughout the emergency. When the parking brake was finally set and the engine shut down, the silence in the cockpit was deafening. Emily sat for a moment, her hands still on the controls, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility lifting from her shoulders. She had done it, despite her injury, despite years of being grounded, despite everyone who had told her to let go of her identity as a pilot. She had proven that she was still capable of extraordinary things. The cabin door opened, and medical personnel rushed in to attend to the original pilots, who had been cared for in the first-class cabin throughout. The emergency Emily watched as they were carefully evacuated, her mind already preparing for the debriefing she knew would come. As she attempted to stand, her leg buckled beneath her. Sarah quickly moved to support her, and for the first time, the flight attendant saw the true cost of their salvation. Emily's pants leg was soaked with blood, where her old wound had reopened during the landing. "You need medical attention," Sarah insisted. But Emily shook her head. "The passengers first," she said firmly. "I need to make sure everyone's okay." It was the military commander in her speaking, the leader who always put her crew and mission first. The scene in the cabin as Emily limped down the aisle was overwhelming. Passengers reached out to touch her, to thank her, many of them crying with relief. The mother with the young child she had noticed earlier hugged her tightly, whispering prayers of gratitude. The businessman who had sat next to her shook her, and with tears in his eyes. Emergency medical technicians waited at the front of the cabin, alerted by Sarah to Emily's condition. As they helped her into a wheelchair, the full impact of what had happened began to sink in. She had taken a commercial airliner with a failed engine through a severe storm and landed it safely with hundreds of lives aboard. She had done it with an injury that should have grounded her, with years of rust that should have dulled her skills. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, the wind dying down to a gentle breeze. As Emily was wheeled through the terminal, she saw news cameras tracking her progress, reporters already gathering to cover the story of the miraculous landing. But her mind was elsewhere, already composing the message she would send to her family, to her therapist, to everyone who had told her to let go of her dreams of flying. The message was simple. Some passions can't be grounded. Some skills don't fade. Some parts of who you are remain unchanged, no matter what life throws at you. And sometimes the very thing everyone tells you to let go of becomes the thing that saves not only your life, but the lives of hundreds of others. As the medical team began to treat her leg, Emily closed her eyes, feeling the familiar vibrations of aircraft taking off and landing nearby. She was home, not in the geographical sense, but in the deeper, more fundamental sense of being exactly where she was meant to be. The sky had called her back, and she had answered, proving that her spirit was stronger than her limitations, her determination greater than her doubts. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of medical examinations, debriefings, and media attention. Emily's leg injury required several stitches where the old wound had reopened, but she refused anything stronger than local anesthetic, insisting on remaining clear-headed for the official incident interviews. The hospital room where she was temporarily confined became a revolving door of visitors. Airline officials, aviation authorities, and even the British Civil Aviation Authority representatives came to hear her account of the emergency. Emily recounted the events with military precision, her voice steady as she detailed every decision, every adjustment, every moment of the crisis. "Your simulator training logs are impressive," one investigator noted, reviewing her background. "But this goes beyond practice. You demonstrated exceptional skill under extreme conditions." Emily thought about all the nights she'd spent in front of those screens, all the times she'd been told she was living in the past. Now, those hours had proved to be the difference between disaster and salvation. Sarah, the flight attendant, who had served as her impromptu co-pilot, stopped by with tears in her eyes. "I had to come see you," she said, sitting beside Emily's bed. "The passengers, they're calling you the Angel of Manchester. The media is going crazy with the story, the wounded veteran who saved hundreds of lives." Emily shifted uncomfortably. At the attention. "We saved those lives together," she corrected, reaching out to squeeze Sarah's hand. "You were there every step of the way." The flight attendant smiled through her tears, pulling out her phone to show Emily the flood of social media posts from grateful passengers and their families. The door opened again, and Emily's heart stopped. Jennifer stood there, their mother, Sarah, right behind her, both of them having taken the first available flight from New York after hearing the news. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Jennifer rushed forward, enveloping her sister in a fierce hug. "You crazy, amazing, impossible person," Jennifer sobbed. "When we got the call, when they told us what happened." She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "Mom was right all along. She always said your obsession with those simulators meant something." Their mother approached more slowly, her face a complex mixture of pride and lingering worry. "Emily," she said, softly touching her daughter's face, "my brave, stubborn girl." The words carried years of concern, of disagreements, of trying to protect a daughter who refused to be protected. "I couldn't let go, Mom," Emily said, her voice finally cracking with emotion. "Everyone told me to move on, to accept my limitations, but I couldn't. Flying isn't just what I do, it's who I am, and yesterday proved that." A knock at the door interrupted their reunion. A distinguished-looking man in an airline uniform entered, flanked by several executives. "Ms. Chen," he began, "I'm Richard Harrison, Chief Operations Officer for United Airlines. What you did yesterday was nothing short of miraculous. We've reviewed the flight data, the weather conditions, everything. Even a fully able-bodied pilot with current commercial certification would have struggled with those conditions." Emily sat straighter in her bed, military bearing asserting itself despite her hospital gown. Harrison continued, "We'd like to offer you a position with our airline, not just as a pilot, though we'll sponsor your commercial certification if you want it, but as a senior training consultant. Your experience, your dedication to simulation training, your ability to handle crisis situations, these are invaluable." The room fell silent. Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Sir," she began, her voice steady, "flying has been my life. When I was injured, everyone told me that chapter was over. They said I needed to find a new purpose, a new identity. But I always knew, that the sky wasn't finished with me yet." Harrison smiled. "Sometimes the hardest part of healing is fighting against those who think they know what's best for us. You never stopped being a pilot, Ms. Chen. You just needed the right moment to prove it to the world." Emily's mother stepped forward. "All this time," she said softly, "we thought we were protecting you, trying to help you adapt to a new life. But you weren't stuck in the past. You were preparing for a future we couldn't see." The hospital room felt too small suddenly, too confined for the emotions filling it. Through the window, Emily could see aircraft taking off and landing at Manchester Airport, their lights piercing the clearing sky. Each one represented what she had never stopped believing in. The possibility of flight, of overcoming, of proving that some limitations exist only in the minds of those who accept them. Jennifer picked up Emily's cane from where it leaned against the bed. "Maybe it's time to see this differently," she said thoughtfully. "Not as a symbol of what you lost, but as a badge of what you've overcome. How many pilots can say they landed a crippled aircraft in a storm on one engine while dealing with a leg injury?" Emily reached out and took the cane, feeling its familiar weight. "It's never been about proving anything to anyone else," she said quietly. "It was about being true to who I am. Everyone saw limitations. I saw challenges to overcome. Everyone saw an obsession with the past. I saw preparation for the future." A nurse entered with medication, but paused at the doorway, sensing the gravity of the moment. Through the open door, Emily could hear the murmur of journalists in the hallway, all eager to tell the story of the wounded veteran who had saved hundreds of lives. But the real story, she knew, wasn't about one emergency landing. It was about refusing to be grounded by others' expectations, about keeping faith with yourself when no one else would. 6 months after the Manchester landing, Emily stood in front of a new flight simulator at United Airlines Training Center in Denver. Her hands rested lightly on her cane as she watched a group of pilot candidates work through emergency scenarios she had helped design. Her legs still ached sometimes, especially in bad weather, but she had long since stopped seeing it as a limitation. The simulator room was state-of-the-art, far more advanced than the setup she'd had in her apartment. Yet it was those countless hours on her home equipment that had prepared her for the moment that changed everything. Now, as United's senior emergency procedures specialist, she was transforming the way pilots trained for crisis situations. "The simulator can only teach you so much," she explained to the pilots in training. "What matters is maintaining your core identity as a pilot, even when you're not in the cockpit. Every moment is preparation for the moment you hope never comes." The candidates listened intently. After all, the story of the Manchester landing had become legend in aviation circles, Dr. Martinez, her former therapist, had called last week. "I was wrong," she had admitted. "What I saw as an inability to move on was actually an unwavering commitment to who you are. You've helped me understand that healing doesn't always mean letting go. Sometimes it means holding on tighter to your truth." Emily's office wall now held two displays. On one side were her military medals, no longer gathering dust, but proudly exhibited alongside new civilian accolades. On the other was the front page of the Manchester Evening News from the day after the landing, its headline bold and clear: "Wounded veteran pilots, crippled aircraft to miraculous landing." Sarah, the flight attendant who had become her friend, was now part of Emily's training team, helping to teach crew coordination during emergencies. They often spoke about that night, about how crisis reveals not just who you are, but who you've always been. "Remember," Emily told her current class, "aviation is unforgiving of carelessness, but it rewards preparation. Every simulator session, every procedure review, every moment spent studying, it all matters." She caught her reflection in the simulator screen, noting how her posture had changed. The cane was still there, but it no longer defined her. If anything, it had become a symbol of perseverance. Her phone buzzed, a message from Jennifer. "Just saw your training program featured in Aviation Weekly. Mum cried when she read it. So proud of you, sis." Emily smiled, remembering the tearful reconciliation with her family. They had finally understood that her refusal to give up flying wasn't denial, it was destiny. The United Airlines executives had kept their word. While her leg injury still prevented her from returning to regular commercial flying, they had created a position that leveraged both her military experience and her proven ability to handle crisis situations. She wasn't just training pilots anymore. She was reshaping how the entire airline industry approached emergency preparation. Later that afternoon, Emily made her way to the airport's observation deck. It had become her favorite spot for lunch. Her breaks, watching aircraft take off and land against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains. A young girl with a drawing pad caught her attention, sketching the planes with intense concentration. "Do you want to be a pilot?" Emily asked, recognizing the same passion she had carried since childhood. The girl nodded enthusiastically, but then pointed to her hearing aids. "They say I can't because of these," she said softly. Emily sat down, beside her, laying her cane against the bench. "Let me tell you a story," she began, "about how limitations are often just challenges in disguise." As she spoke, she watched the girl's eyes light up with hope and determination. The Manchester incident had changed more than just Emily's life. It had sparked a broader conversation about diversity in aviation, about looking beyond traditional limitations to see the true measure of a pilot's capability. The airline industry was slowly learning what Emily had known all along, that the strongest pilots weren't necessarily those with perfect physical conditions, but those with an unwavering commitment to their calling. A massive United 787 lifted off its engines roaring with power as it climbed into the Colorado sky. Emily felt the familiar surge of excitement, the connection to flight that had never wavered, not even in her darkest moments. Her phone buzzed again, a message from the airline's chief pilot about a new crisis response protocol she had proposed. The young girl was still sketching, now adding a figure in the cockpit to her airplane drawing. "Is that you?" Emily asked, noting the determined expression the girl had given her pilot. "No," the girl replied with a smile. "That's me in the future." Emily nodded, understanding completely. She pulled out her business card and wrote her personal email. On the back, "When you're ready to start your journey," she said, "contact me. I know something about overcoming obstacles to reach the sky." As she stood to leave, Emily caught her reflection in the observation deck's windows. The setting sun cast her shadow long across the ground, her silhouette merging with those of the aircraft taking off beyond. She was no longer the grounded pilot, the wounded veteran, or even the hero of Manchester. She was simply herself, a woman who had never stopped believing in her ability to fly, in whatever form that might take. The young girl waved goodbye, already returning to her drawings, to her dreams of flight. Emily made her way back to the training center, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the concrete. Above her, planes continued their eternal dance of takeoffs and landings, each one a reminder that the sky has room for all kinds of pilots, especially those who refuse to be grounded by anything, even themselves. 1 year after the Manchester landing, Emily stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Behind her, a massive screen displayed the flight data recordings from that stormy night, showing the impossible trajectory that had brought United 847 safely to ground. The audience was filled with aviation professionals, military personnel, and aspiring pilots from across the country. "They say that character is revealed in crisis," Emily began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "But I believe character is built in the quiet moments before crisis ever strikes. It's built in the hours of preparation that others call obsession. It's forged in the determination to stay true to yourself when everyone else tells you to change." The symposium on emergency aviation procedures had drawn record attendance, largely due to Emily's presence as keynote speaker. Her story had transformed from a single incident of heroism into a movement that was changing how the aviation industry viewed pilot qualification and training. United Airlines' new training program, developed under Emily's guidance, had been adopted by major carriers worldwide. The simulator scenarios she designed, incorporating both technical skills and psychological resilience, were revolutionizing how pilots prepared for emergencies. But more importantly, her example had opened doors for other pilots who faced physical challenges. "Last month," Emily continued, "I received a letter from a young pilot who lost her arm in a car accident. She had been told her flying days were over, but after hearing about Manchester, she fought back. Today, she's flying cargo routes with a prosthetic arm, proving that adaptation isn't admission of limitation. It's evidence of determination." In the front row, Sarah sat beside Emily's family, all of them beaming with pride. The flight attendant had become an integral part of Emily's story, traveling with her to speaking engagements and helping to demonstrate the importance of crew coordination during emergencies. Their friendship, forged in crisis, had become a testament to the bonds that form when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances together. The real story of Manchester isn't about one landing or one pilot, Emily said, gesturing to the flight data behind her. It's about the power of refusing to be grounded by other people's expectations. It's about recognizing that our greatest limitations often exist only in the minds of those who would hold us back. Dr. Martinez was there, too, having become an advocate for changing how the medical community approached pilot rehabilitation. Her research paper on the psychological benefits of maintaining professional identity during physical recovery had sparked important discussions in both aviation and medical circles. Emily's mother dabbed at her eyes as she watched her daughter command the room. The wall of medals in Emily's old apartment had been relocated to a place of honor in United's training center, alongside a display about the Manchester landing. But more meaningful than any medal was the change Emily had inspired in the industry's perspective on what made a capable pilot. Today, we're announcing the creation of the Second Chances in Aviation Foundation, Emily revealed, drawing excited murmurs from the crowd. This organization will provide support, training, and advocacy for pilots who face physical challenges but refuse to give up their passion for flight. Because sometimes, the most important qualification a pilot can have is the unwavering belief in their ability to overcome. The foundation, funded by a coalition of airlines and aviation companies, would offer specialized training programs, adaptive equipment research, and legal advocacy for pilots fighting to maintain their certification despite physical challenges. It was a testament to how one person's refusal to be grounded could lift others to new heights. The sky doesn't care about your limitations, Emily concluded, her voice strong with conviction. It cares about your preparation, your judgment, your determination. When that storm hit and both pilots were incapacitated, it wasn't my perfectly functioning body that saved us. It was years of preparation that everyone else had dismissed as denial. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes. As Emily made her way back to her seat, aided by her cane but walking tall, she passed dozens of people whose lives had been touched by her story. There was the young girl with hearing aids now enrolled in flight school, the veteran who had lost his leg but was back in the cockpit flying medical evacuation missions, the instructor who had revolutionized her teaching methods to accommodate students with physical challenges. Later that evening, as Emily stood at the museum's observation deck watching aircraft take off and land at nearby Reagan National Airport, she reflected on how far she had come from that apartment with its flight simulators and dusty medals. Her legs still ached, especially on long days like this, but the pain had become a reminder of triumph rather than limitation. A child's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Are you the pilot who landed the plane with one engine?" a young boy asked, looking up at her with awe. Emily smiled, remembering all the times she had looked up at pilots with the same expression. "I'm a pilot who refused to stop being a pilot," she corrected gently, "and sometimes that makes all the difference." Above them, a United 787 climbed into the evening sky, its lights twinkling like stars, a reminder that the horizon never ends for those who refuse to be grounded. 5 years after the Manchester landing, Emily Chen stood in the cockpit of a brand new flight simulator at the Second Chances in Aviation Foundation's headquarters. The facility, built specifically to accommodate pilots with various physical challenges, represented everything she had fought for since that stormy night over the Atlantic. The simulator incorporated cutting-edge adaptive technologies that allowed pilots with different physical limitations to maintain their skills and certifications. Emily's own experiences had directly influenced its design, ensuring that determination and skill could overcome physical constraints. Today's simulation will focus on emergency procedures during severe weather conditions, Emily announced to her class of student pilots. Among them was Maria, the young girl with hearing aids she'd met years ago at the observation deck. Now 18, Maria was on track to become one of the youngest licensed pilots in the program's history. The foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What had started as a simple idea had blossomed into a global movement, with centers in London, Dubai, Singapore, and Sydney. Each location offered specialized training programs, rehabilitation services, and most importantly, a community that understood that being a pilot was more than just a profession. It was an identity. Emily watched as Maria took the pilot's seat, her movements confident and precise. The hearing aids that had once been seen as a disqualifying factor were now just another part of her equipment, like Emily's cane. The industry had learned that adaptation wasn't weakness, it was innovation. "Remember," Emily said, addressing the whole class, "every limitation you face is an opportunity to prove that the sky belongs to those who refuse to be grounded. 5 years ago, I was told my story was done, that I needed to accept a new reality, but sometimes the most important reality is the one you create through sheer determination." The Manchester incident had become required study in aviation schools. Worldwide, not just for its technical aspects, but for its lesson in human resilience. The flight data recordings, the weather conditions, the single-engine landing, all of it was analyzed and taught. But the most important lesson wasn't in the data or the procedures. It was in the story of a pilot who refused to stop being a pilot. Sarah, who had transitioned from flight attendant to become the Foundation's Chief of Crew Resource Management, entered the simulator room. She still marveled at how far they'd come from that terrifying night. "Ready for the surprise?" she asked Emily with a knowing smile. The simulator room's door opened, and in walked Captain Richard Harrison, now United Airlines Chief of Operations, followed by a film crew. "Miss Chen," he began, "or should I say Captain Chen, the documentary about the Manchester landing and your foundation is ready for release. We thought you might like to see it first." The lights dimmed, and the simulator screens transformed into a massive display. The documentary began with the weather radar images from that stormy night, followed by air traffic control recordings that captured the drama of United 847's emergency. But what followed wasn't just the story of one miraculous landing. It was the story of how one person's refusal to be grounded had lifted countless others to new heights. As the documentary played, Emily looked around at her students' faces, seeing in them the same determination she had carried through her darkest days. Maria, watching intently, unconsciously adjusted her hearing aids, not with shame, but with the confidence of someone who knew her differences were her strength. The final scene showed Emily at last year's International Aviation Conference, where she had received the Industry Innovation Award for the Foundation's work. Her acceptance speech had brought the audience to tears. The sky doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about your physical limitations. It cares about your heart, your mind, and your unwavering belief in yourself. As the lights came up, Captain Harrison stepped forward. "Emily, your story has inspired a generation of pilots to push beyond their perceived limitations. This documentary will ensure that inspiration continues to spread." Emily gripped her cane, feeling the familiar weight that had become not a symbol of limitation, but a badge of perseverance. "The story isn't mine anymore," she said, looking at her students. "It belongs to everyone who has ever been told they can't fly and decided to prove otherwise." The Foundation's motto, displayed prominently on the wall, caught the light. "The only ground that holds us is the ground we choose to stand on." It was more than just words. It was a testament to the power of refusing to let others define your limitations. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of courage, determination, and the unwavering spirit of aviation. If you've been inspired by Emily's story, remember that your own wings are waiting to be spread. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to receive more amazing stories of triumph over adversity. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that limitations are often just challenges in disguise. Join our community of dreamers and achievers, where every story is a reminder that the sky's the limit, only if you choose to be grounded. Until next time, keep soaring high.